There was a time when royal weddings were more than celebrations. They were stages of power, protocol, and secrecy. No cameras, no journalists, just polished smiles hiding hidden tensions. While history books record the grandeur, few reveal the whispers of fear, obedience, and the unspoken rules that governed every gesture. Most royal couples met for the first time at their own wedding ceremonies, exchanging polite nods and careful glances before retiring to chambers filled with anticipation, curiosity, and in many cases, dread. Love was rarely the reason they were brought together. Alliances, wealth, and dynastic survival dictated their unions. Yet behind these ceremonial walls, the nights often concealed horrors and humiliations that would remain unspoken for centuries. A bride's trembling hands, a servant girl's silent witnessing, or a whisper in the hall could decide the course of lives. Some nuptials were celebrated with music and opulence above, while below shadows carried secrets darker than anyone dared imagine. Every corridor, every candlelit hall, every locked door held a story of power, fear, and hidden cruelty. For those trapped in these gilded cages, the so-called joyous wedding night could mark the beginning of a lifelong struggle against humiliation, oppression, and injustice. The grand hall gleamed with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light over silk drapes and polished marble floors. Courtiers whispered as they moved in measured steps, each one aware of their place, each one bound by invisible chains of etiquette. The air smelled of incense, perfume, and a tension so thick it almost pressed against the walls. Amid the orchestrated smiles and forced laughter, a young servant girl lingered at the edges of the room. Her presence was barely acknowledged, an invisible witness to the pomp and pretense, but her eyes absorbed every detail. The way the bride's hand trembled as she lifted her bouquet, the subtle nods of approval exchanged between the parents, the fleeting glare of a nobleman asserting dominance. She had seen these rituals before, yet each time the contrast between the lavish ceremony and the suffering beneath felt sharper, more cutting. Outside, carriages rolled along cobbled streets, carrying dignitaries who had traveled for days to witness the union of power. Inside, chambers buzzed with preparation, robes adjusted, jewels fastened, masks of contentment painted onto weary faces. But not all were content. The whispers told stories of alliances forged not in love, but in political convenience, and the youngest members of the court had begun to understand the harsh truths hidden behind gilded doors. The bride, a young woman of noble blood, had been trained her entire life for this moment. She knew the steps, the phrases, the subtle gestures expected of her. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the solitude of her wedding night, where the absence of familiarity and affection would become painfully clear. She was guided to her chamber by attendants whose faces were kind but distant, their hands performing their duties with precision rather than warmth. Meanwhile, the servant girl, though powerless, felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She had grown up learning the unspoken rules: who could speak, who must bow, who would be punished for a careless glance. Her world was one of shadows, yet tonight she sensed that even shadows could reveal truths. She watched as the bride's chamber door closed, locking a mixture of anticipation and fear within. Outside the chamber, courtiers celebrated. Music played, wine flowed, and to the untrained eye happiness reigned. But beneath the laughter, secrets festered. Every gesture of affection was measured, every compliment rehearsed. The young bride would soon realize that obedience was expected above emotion, and that deviation could have consequences far beyond embarrassment. Through the night, the palace itself seemed alive. The walls absorbed whispers, the tapestries held onto the echo of footsteps, and the corridors hid eyes that watched every misstep. In this world, power dictated behavior, and even the smallest act of defiance could ripple across generations. For those at the bottom, the invisible servants, the marginalized, the vulnerable, nights like these were lessons in survival. And as the first candle burned low, casting elongated shadows across the marble floors, the servant girl felt a chill of understanding. History remembers the victors, but the stories of the oppressed are etched in silence. Tonight, in this gilded palace, some would celebrate, some would mourn, and some would simply survive, each carrying forward secrets that the history books might never reveal. The days following the wedding were deceptively calm. The palace glittered in morning sunlight, gardens bloomed with vibrant colors, and every hall echoed with rehearsed greetings. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, a different story was unfolding. one invisible to the guests but painfully clear to those bound by servitude and the subtle hierarchies of blood and status. The young bride, isolated in her chamber, began to sense the full weight of her position. No one had explained the unspoken rules of submission that accompanied her role. Each instruction she received, from how to carry her posture to how to speak in the presence of dignitaries, was layered with implied threats. Any hesitation, any trace of personal preference could be noticed and punished, though the methods were subtle: a cold glare, a whispered reprimand, or the quiet removal of privilege. Meanwhile, the servant girl continued to navigate the palace halls with silent vigilance. She saw the distinctions between the noble-born and the others, the dismissive nods, the way meals were portioned, the small but deliberate insults hidden in casual conversation. These were not merely acts of pride, they were signs of systemic prejudice, a daily choreography of control and exclusion. One evening, the bride's chamber prepared for a visit from a visiting noble family. The servant girl was tasked with ensuring everything was perfect. As she adjusted the folds of a dress and straightened the hair of the young bride, she noticed the anxiety in the girl's eyes. The bride's nervous glance at a looming, imposing guest reflected more than fear of judgment. It reflected the reality that her body, her image, and even her compliance were commodities in a game of power. In another wing of the palace, whispers circulated about servants who had dared to voice opinions or seek minor liberties. The consequences were severe but often invisible to outsiders: reassignment to menial labor, withdrawal of basic privileges, or the silent scorn of those with influence. The system was designed to teach obedience through fear, ensuring that every person knew their place and rarely challenged it. The tension escalated during a formal dinner. Guests celebrated the union, toasting with crystal glasses, while below the polished floors the servant girl witnessed the injustice hidden in plain sight. A noble child pushed a younger servant aside, laughing, as the child's guardian offered nothing but a polite smile. The girl's stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with recognition of the cruelty that went unpunished. It was a small act, but a perfect reflection of the institutionalized inequalities woven into every layer of the palace life. Even within the bride's family, subtle discrimination and favoritism shaped interactions. Servants of different backgrounds were treated differently, their voices unheard, their needs secondary. The young bride, still learning her role, could not fully intervene. Her understanding of morality conflicted with the expectations imposed upon her by tradition and by a society that valued rank over compassion. As days turned into nights, the palace's splendor became a cage. The servant girl walked corridors lined with gold and velvet, fully aware that she was powerless to change the system, yet increasingly determined to observe, record, and survive. The young bride, meanwhile, began to internalize the tension, the delicate balance between compliance and conscience. Every misstep, every gaze that lingered too long, every whispered remark contributed to a growing storm of emotional and psychological tension. It was clear that this wedding, meant to signify joy and union, had already set the stage for suffering, subtle manipulation, and the exercise of unchecked power. The stage was set. The players were aware that history would remember some moments and erase others. The palace seemed to breathe with secrets. Behind each carved door and velvet curtain, lives unfolded under the scrutiny of tradition and prejudice. One evening, the young bride was summoned to assist with preparations for a ceremonial feast. As she moved through the corridors, the servant girl shadowed her silently, noting the small acts of discrimination that went unnoticed by the wealthy and powerful. A guest from a distant kingdom arrived, his eyes sharp, his manners cold. He inspected the servants with subtle contempt, judging their appearance, their posture, even their accents. The servant girl, invisible to most, felt the sting of awareness. Every motion was being weighed against invisible standards, every breath scrutinized. The bride's cheeks flushed as she realized that her own approval of these minor injustices could either shield or endanger those beneath her. During the feast, a young page stumbled while serving wine. The mistake, trivial in any ordinary household, was met with harsh reprimand. The guests' laughter echoed across the hall, a chilling reminder of the hierarchy that controlled lives through fear. The servant girl's heart tightened. She had seen this many times before. The palace taught obedience not through kindness, but through humiliation and invisible chains. Later that night, a heated confrontation unfolded in a smaller chamber. A young servant, brave enough to challenge a noble's careless cruelty, was swiftly punished, not with violence visible to the public, but through social isolation and denial of even small privileges. The bride witnessed this, her mind torn between empathy and the rules imposed upon her. She began to understand that power was maintained by suppressing dissent, and that moral courage carried invisible yet devastating consequences. Outside whispers spread among the servants. They spoke of a time when even minor infractions could lead to public shaming or reassignment to the most grueling labor. These stories, passed in hushed tones, were warnings. In this palace, prejudice and hierarchy were law, and kindness alone offered no protection. The bride's perspective began to shift. She noticed the stark contrast between the opulence surrounding her and the suffering quietly endured by those serving her. The servant girl's eyes, always observing, seemed to silently narrate these injustices. Every glance at the trembling hands of a young attendant, every forced smile masking fear, deepened the emotional tension. The bride realized she was no longer merely a participant in a ritual. She had become a witness to cruelty hidden beneath ceremonial splendor. As the days progressed, the emotional stakes intensified. Invitations to private gatherings, the distribution of favors, and the silent endorsements of certain nobles created a web of inequality. The bride's attempts to navigate this labyrinth without offending anyone became increasingly perilous. She began to understand that in this world, even compassion could be dangerous, and silence often served as the only shield. By the time the palace candles burned low and the night wrapped its cold fingers around the spires, tension reached its peak. Every shadow seemed to whisper reminders of power, injustice, and the fragility of those who dared to question the status quo. The servant girl moved silently through the halls, the memory of countless injustices etched into her mind, while the bride's heart pulsed with the knowledge that the climax of this story, the moment when hidden cruelty and public appearances collide, was inevitable. The night had fallen like a velvet curtain, casting shadows that danced across the grand halls of the palace. Candles flickered weakly, their light barely touching the corners where fear and secrecy thrived. The young bride, poised yet trembling, entered her chamber only to find the air heavy with expectation and dread. Every servant, every attendant seemed to hold their breath, as if the walls themselves anticipated the unfolding of an unspoken cruelty. Suddenly a nobleman appeared, his presence commanding the room with an invisible weight. He inspected the arrangements with cold precision, then turned his gaze toward a young servant who had dared a small, unintentional mistake earlier that day. The correction, trivial in any ordinary world, was met with a harsh rebuke that echoed through the silent chamber. The servant's shoulders slumped, shame burning hotter than any fire, as the young bride felt a pang of helplessness she had never known. It was in that moment the reality of her position crystallized. The ceremonial night, meant to symbolize unity and celebration, had become a theater of power, oppression, and humiliation. Every gesture, every command, every carefully measured smile was an instrument of control. The young bride's heart ached for the innocent souls hidden behind the polished veneer of luxury, trapped in roles that demanded compliance over conscience. The servant girl, ever watchful, stepped back into the shadows, witnessing the subtle, ruthless mechanisms of the palace. She saw the quiet cruelty, the way fear was enforced without words, the invisible barriers that kept some alive and others crushed. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the gilded room. And then it happened, a slip, a whispered misstep, a fleeting moment of defiance by a young page. The nobleman's glare cut through the air, sharper than any blade. Time seemed to freeze as the consequences descended, not as a public spectacle, but as an invisible, crushing weight of authority. The young bride's breath caught, her pulse racing as she realized that no one, no matter how privileged, was immune to the cold machinery of oppression. In that single, terrifying moment, the palace revealed its true nature. Beneath the glittering halls and polished floors lay a world of fear, injustice, and cruelty, meticulously concealed from the eyes of the outside world. The bride and the servant girl alike understood that history, though it may celebrate splendor, often erases the pain endured by the powerless. The climax of this night was not in drama or spectacle, it was in the quiet, devastating realization of how deeply inequality and prejudice could shape lives, futures, and legacies. The first light of dawn seeped into the palace, casting soft gold across marble floors and velvet drapes. For the young bride, the night's events lingered like a shadow she could not shake. She moved through the halls with a new awareness. Every smile she had offered, every nod of compliance, had been a small act in a much larger performance of power. The grandeur that once dazzled her now felt hollow, revealing the invisible machinery of oppression that governed not just her life, but the lives of everyone in the palace. The servant girl, still unseen yet ever present, felt a sense of quiet resilience. She had witnessed the cruelty, the subtle injustices, and the harsh enforcement of obedience. And yet in that observation, she found strength. History may have favored the wealthy, the powerful, and the entitled, but the memory of suffering, the endurance of those oppressed, was a truth no amount of opulence could erase. She carried the weight of these nights with her, a silent chronicler of injustice. As days passed, the young bride began to navigate her role with a more profound understanding. She realized that kindness, when offered carefully, could ripple quietly through the palace. A reassuring word to a trembling servant, a discreet protection of a vulnerable soul. These small acts became gestures of rebellion against the cruelty ingrained in tradition. Though she could not dismantle the palace hierarchy overnight, she learned that empathy could survive even in the most rigid of systems. The events of the wedding night and the days that followed became etched in memory, not as scandals or gossip, but as lessons in morality, power, and the human spirit. Every corner of the palace bore witness to the tension between authority and conscience, obedience and justice. The young bride's awakening, paired with the servant girl's silent courage, illustrated a profound truth, that even in worlds dominated by inequality, the choices of individuals matter. Outside the palace walls, life continued unaware of the microcosm of fear, courage, and quiet rebellion within. The celebrations, the music, the festivals, these were seen by the public as symbols of prosperity and joy. Yet behind closed doors, history's untold stories of oppression, endurance, and moral awakening unfolded, shaping lives and legacies in ways that the chronicles rarely acknowledged. In reflecting upon these events, one is left to ponder, how many moments of injustice have been hidden behind the glitter of ceremonies, the pomp of tradition, and the authority of power? How many silent witnesses, like the servant girl, carry the truth that history itself forgets? And perhaps most crucially, how can empathy and courage, though small, ripple outward to challenge systems built on oppression? As the palace settled into a tentative calm, the bride and the servant girl each faced the dawn with new understanding. One held the power of position tempered by conscience, the other, the quiet strength of resilience and witness. Together, in their own ways, they carried forward the lessons of fear, injustice, and moral courage, reminding us that the human spirit can endure even the most oppressive systems. And as the sun rose higher, spilling light over gilded corridors, one truth became clear. The history of power is incomplete without the stories of those who endured it silently, and the courage to acknowledge them may be the truest form of revolution. In a gilded palace where music and laughter masked fear, a young bride stepped into a world where power dictated every gesture. Most royal couples met for the first time on their wedding day, yet behind ceremonial splendor lurked cruelty and invisible hierarchies. A servant girl watched silently, noting subtle acts of discrimination, whispered insults and unjust punishments that kept the powerless in their place. As the feast progressed, tensions escalated. A minor mistake by a young page met with harsh rebuke, revealing the palace's system of fear. The bride realized her own privilege came with responsibility. Every act of compassion could ripple quietly against injustice. By dawn, the palace remained dazzling, yet its hidden cruelty lingered. The bride and the servant girl each carried forward lessons of empathy, resilience, and moral courage, showing that even in oppressive systems, the human spirit can endure, and small acts of kindness can leave a lasting mark.